Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you've handed us a truly thought-provoking collection. Gore Vidal's Sexually Speaking Collected Sex Writings, 1960-1998.
It's quite something.
It really is. Our mission in this deep dive is to extract the core of Vidal's perspectives on sex, morality, law, politics, culture, all of it, as they weave through these essays and interviews.
Yeah, to really get to the heart of his recurring arguments and observations for you.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, what's fascinating right for the preface is Vidal recounting Tennessee Williams' experience with gay critics. They were apparently pressuring Williams to limit his plays to exclusively gay characters and themes.
And Williams's response was pretty sharp, wasn't it?
Exactly. Why should I limit my audience any more than it is already? Which immediately flags a key insight for you. Vidal clearly shared this resistance to narrow identity politics in art.
Right. He felt art should explore the breadth of human experience.
Absolutely.
And Vidal picks up on what he calls the sinister underlying sentiment of these critics, this idea that the gay condition is somehow so uniquely central.
That should overshadow everything else in art.
Yeah.
He saw this as a form of dull bigotry, which is, well, a pretty strong stance right out of the gate, wouldn't you say?
It is.
Yeah.
And it connects directly to a larger theme Vidal keeps coming back to. This tendency of moralists, especially, after Christianity's main authority started to wane.
To look to the state to punish sin.
Precisely. He brings in J.G. Stephen, a prominent Victorian legal theorist who had a rather stark view.
Stark is one word for it.
He suggested feelings of hatred and the desire for vengeance regarding moral offenders ought, in such cases, to be satisfied in a regular public and legal manner. It really highlights this historical argument for state punishment rooted in moral belief.
Right. Stephen's view almost sounds like legal retribution fueled by pure vengeance. And Lord Goddard apparently echoed that, seeing vengeance as praiseworthy.
But then Stephen adds that crucial caveat. Laws can't really punish what public opinion doesn't strongly condemn.
Exactly. Which leaves you in a complex spot when you're talking about something as personal, as varied as sexual morality.
Which leads perfectly to Professor Hart's contrasting view.
Yeah, Hart suggests there isn't necessarily one unified moral majority on sex. Instead, you might have these mutually tolerant moralities.
Tolerant moralities.
Yeah.
Interesting.
He even proposes that maybe offenders might just be met with, amused contempt or pity instead of outright hatred, which paints a very different picture.
It really does. It raises that fundamental question for you about the proper role of law in enforcing what are basically fluid and often contested moral beliefs.
Which brings us neatly to Vidal's view on sex and law in the U.S.
Yeah.
He points straight at the Puritans.
Those religious fundamentalists who fled England, interestingly, he says, not because they were persecuted, but because they weren't allowed to persecute others.
Yeah, that's Vidal's take. Once in North America, they set up their quasi-theocracy, gravitated towards this rather unforgiving Old Testament God, finding St. Paul's sternness more appealing than Jesus' compassion.
And how did that translate into law? Because that's the key thing.
Well, unlike England, before or after Cromwell, the Puritans actually made adultery and fornication criminal offenses.
Right, criminal, not just frowned upon.
And this legacy, Vidal emphasizes, has been incredibly persistent. Even when he was writing, many U.S. states still had laws punishing these private acts.
Which is such a contrast to most other Western countries, right? England, Japan, even the Soviet Union, France, Germany. They mostly didn't have those kinds of statutes, or had very limited ones.
Exactly. It really makes you consider the lasting power of that early American social engineering.
It's quite striking. And Vidal mentions Illinois as an early, though maybe limited, example of reform in '62. They decriminalized deviate sexual acts.
But they still penalized open and notorious adultery and fornication.
Right.
So even with reform, the state still felt it had a role in regulating private behavior for public morality.
Vidal seems pretty critical of the slowness of the liberal community to challenge these laws.
Very critical. He basically suggests that changing these codes across the states would be a worthwhile project for liberals, since these laws affect almost everyone.
He notes the irony, doesn't he? The U.S. starts with separating church and state, then embeds religious or moral concerns into state law.
Leading to a lot of suffering and, often arbitrary enforcement.
And it wasn't just that these laws were fading away. Vidal points to conservatives actively trying to strengthen them.
Yeah, he cites that pamphlet in Florida, denouncing homosexuals in really archaic terms,
Mhm.
and that shocking 15-year sentence for Candy Bar in Dallas
He argues the official charge was marijuana, but the real reason?
was likely that the jury saw her as a sinful woman who'd crossed their moral lines.
Yeah. Which I suppose naturally leads into Vidal's take on Henry Miller's sexist. Even though the law changed, Vidal wasn't exactly impressed, literally speaking.
Not at all. He basically sees Miller as fundamentally egocentric. The whole book revolves around Henry Miller and all his sweet monotony.
He calls the other characters shadows in a solipsist's daydream, just there to reflect Miller.
Pretty much. All reflecting Miller's relentless self-promotion.
Vidal breaks down Miller's recurring poses, right?
Yeah.
The sexual athlete, the literary genius, the cosmic figure.
Yeah, and he finds the narrative just haphazard, often relying on Miller meeting some new person who instantly adores him, praises him like a messiah.
And Vidal dryly notes that nobody ever just tells Miller, Henry, you're full of it.
Though he suspects that might have happened more often in reality.
What about Miller's writing style? Vidal makes a distinction there.
He does. He points out this contrast between the old-fashioned American demotic,
Yeah.
maybe like Dreiser.
And then these more elaborate, almost pretentious prose poems where Miller works the cosmos for all it's worth.
Right, throwing in fancy words. But Vial finds even the deep thoughts in Sexus pretty superficial. Like you could reverse their meaning and it wouldn't matter much.
Makes you wonder if the shock value was the main point.
Could be.
So, from Miller's grand pronouncements, Vidal pivots to something more intimate. Pornography and sexual fantasy.
Yeah, he starts with that classic, slightly awkward sex joke. You know, the one about lovers wondering who the other's really thinking about. Vidal sees this as revealing a common, awful recognition that mental images often act as an erotic supplement.
A supplement to the physical act itself.
Right. And he argues that for people in, say, unsatisfying relationships or facing societal restrictions on sex, fantasy becomes almost unavoidable.
He mentions Kingsley Amos's character conjugating Latin verbs to delay orgasm.
Yes. But Vettel focuses more on what D.H. Lawrence called the sex-in-the-head middle classes.
And here's where it gets really interesting, right? Vidal suggests this isn't just a choice, but a result of economics.
With delayed marriage.
And tribal law, the taboo against sex outside marriage.
Exactly. Which leads to this long period of masturbation for many, where the theater of the mind becomes this, like, private festival.
He even cheekily suggests it might explain why Bernard Shaw supposedly found actual sex disappointing.
And wonders if Shaw's late start affected his drama. He even proposes this new field of study, characteristics of the onanist as dramatist.
From the private mind to public publishing, Maurice Girodias.
Ah, yes. Vidal sees him as uniquely significant among porn publishers. A second-generation purveyor of dirty books, basically.
Following his father, Jacques Caheen, who founded the Obelisk Press in Paris.
Right, in the 30s. Caheen published some big names, actually Anais Nin, Durrell, Cyril Connolly, and of course Henry Miller, whose books were passed around for years.
And Girodias, the son, kept it going after the war.
Sold Miller to GIs, revived Fanny Hill. Vidal points out this tendency in visionary dictatorships.
Whether led by a person or an ideology.
To disapprove of irregular sex. They often try to compensate for a lack of public morality by enforcing rigid private morality.
And Girodias himself got into trouble for publishing Miller in France.
He did in 1946, the first big obscenity trial since Madame Bovary. Luckily, writers rallied and the government dropped it.
Vidal then gets into the definition of pornography, calculated to arouse sexual excitement.
And he stresses how subjective that is. What excites one person repels another. He mentions a U.S. court saying books with ladies and whips can't corrupt everyone because, well, not everyone wants to be beaten.
Highlights how personal it is.
Totally. Vidal argues pornography doesn't really proselytize. It's for those already interested. He jokes his worst effect is probably on English prose.
He also mentions Girodias' own peculiar moral judgments, like how he describes Sir Roger Casement.
Right, calls him as a superlative pederast, while acknowledging his complexities, yet still praising his generosity and courage. It's quite a description.
Always observing human nature, Vidal then turns to the Marquis de Sade, a more extreme viewpoint.
Definitely. He focuses on an excerpt from Justine, this idea of using others purely as objects for pleasure, preferably at their expense.
And Sade justifies this with an 18th century view of nature as indifferent to good and bad.
Exactly. Leading to the idea that the strong are meant to violate the weak.
Vidal dismisses it as simple-minded Manichaeism, right? Presented with more heat than logic.
Pretty much. Though he does find a certain Marlovian note in Side's desire to outrage nature itself, to destroy its works. Although Vidal wryly adds, Sade doesn't quite pull it off.
Okay, so shifting again, Vidal looks at the changing landscape of sexuality and morality. He argues the old laws against irregular sexuality were mostly about,
Venereal disease and unwanted babies. Practical concerns, basically.
but science changed the game, didn't it? Treatments for STIs, contraception, better hygiene.
They fundamentally altered those old arguments. Yet Vidal notes the predictable moralist response, comparing modern society to the fall of Rome due to sexual license and excessive bathing.
A view he finds simplistic and inaccurate.
Very much so. He highlights the paradox. The city is the glory of our race, yet we cling to these tribal codes of ancient conquerors, even though our lives are totally different.
And the conflict between delayed marriage for economic reasons and the taboo on premarital sex.
Creates what he calls a monstrous sexual ethic. Plus, the old man plus woman baby equation is completely changed by overpopulation and famine concerns.
He even jokes about incest becoming less marketable as a theme, possibly due to smaller houses compared to big Victorian ones.
Yes, it's a typically Vidal observation.
Now, homosexuality. Violent pornographers now take it for granted, reflecting a broader shift.
But there's still that ancient, somewhat ambivalent hostility. He cites Time magazine calling it a pernicious sickness even then.
Underscoring that lingering tribal hostility.
Exactly. He dives into the historical inconsistencies, too. The need for procreation versus, say, homosexuality among warriors in cultures like Sparta.
He contrasts that with the Jewish tradition's consistent opposition to homosexuality and the male as an erotic figure.
Right. Whereas pre-Christian cultures, from Archilochus to Apuleius, often saw homosexual acts as just a matter of taste. Even Suetonius's emperors.
And Vidal's own stances.
That we're all fundamentally bisexual. Opportunity and habit shape our choices. He dismisses the idea that homosexual acts are inherently antisocial or neurotic as dangerous nonsense.
He really goes after Dr. Edmund Berkler's cures for homosexuality.
Yeah, drawing that powerful analogy to trying to change Jewish noses or straighten black hair for assimilation. It's a strong critique.
So for Vidal, the only sexual norm is
that there is no single norm. The law should just protect people from unwanted interference. He explicitly disagrees with Illinois still treating adultery as a crime.
And he makes a case for prostitution.
Calls it a most useful of human institutions. He notes that while liberals opposed it due to poverty links, it thrives in affluent societies because the need persists.
He mentions that Swedish psychologists' proposal for state brothels,
acknowledging the middle-aged woman's sexual peak and declining competitiveness in the private market. He sees prostitutes as practitioners of an art, like masseurs or psychiatrists, maybe even enjoying their work.
and credits pornographers, maybe unintentionally, with revealing the sheer variety of human sexual response.
Exactly.
Then he turns his critical eye on Dr. Rubin.
Oh, yes. He basically calls Rubin unscientific, relying on snappy generalities and maybe even made-up stats.
He contrasts Rubin's modern views on contraception with his more orthodox, almost mosaic view of homosexuality.
Right. Points out Rubin's horror of homosexual promiscuity, his unsubstantiated claims about their primary interest being the penis.
And draws that disturbing parallel to anti-Semitic propaganda.
Yes, and the recurring obsession with the Comintern theory, that supposed gay conspiracy. And the sad fact that fag baiting was often the last acceptable form of minority baiting.
He contrasts Rubin with Kinsey.
Right. He gives Kinsey credit, despite Rubin dismissing him, for actually trying to understand real sexual behavior. Kinsey's work showed everyone's potential bisexuality and the diversity of sexual activity.
Which figures like Bergler and Rubin rejected?
Because they didn't believe bisexuality existed? Vidal highlights the traditional rabbinical view. Any same-sex act condemns you to Sodom, regardless of other behavior.
And the paradox of therapists working with exclusively homosexual people.
Based on the assumption they don't really enjoy men. It's bizarre. He shares that anecdote about his friend and the Wyoming cowhand.
Illustrating different cultural views on same-sex acts.
And the general tendency to dismiss evidence from other cultures if it doesn't fit our beliefs.
Okay, shifting gears now to women's liberation and feminism. Vidal argues that liberating the sexes requires
fundamental changes in the economic system, not the other way around. He sees women as historically conditioned to be brainless, enticing bunnies serving men.
He seems surprised the movement didn't happen sooner given the history of subjugation.
He does. He references Fige's work on how external norms shape internal feelings. Notes the link between women and property, making adultery an economic threat,
He dismisses thinkers like Rousseau and Darwin on women.
as products of their patriarchal biases.
Hmm.
Mentions Schopenhauer's awful views, and points out the disturbing link between anti-feminism and anti-Semitism in figures like Nietzsche and Hitler.
He criticizes Freud, too, right? For not questioning the status quo.
Yeah, and for his views on female sexuality, like penis envy, he notes Fige's counter. Castration fears and penis envy are products of repressive patriarchal societies.
Then he discusses the patriarch's counterattack against feminism.
Citing attacks on Kate Millett by Mailer and Irving Howe, he describes Mailer's attitude as almost like a VFW commander.
Using the Bible selectively. And Howe's agitated tone, his pejorative use of middle class, his distortion of Millett's footnote on Nazis in the family.
Vidal suggests underlying this backlash is a fear of women's revenge, of being treated as sexual objects themselves.
He observes the changing acceptability of male nudes in porn.
But notes erections were often still censored. Contrast it with ancient Greece, where unmarried girls could watch naked athletes, but married women couldn't.
And concludes the patriarchal defense is often made on a stack of Bibles.
A pointed remark.
Now, Eleanor Roosevelt. Vidal talks about our fascination with the private lives of the powerful.
And the American fondness for soap operas about them, especially their illnesses.
Yeah.
He discusses Joseph Lash's biography, Eleanor and Franklin.
Calling it the wastebasket school for including every detail.
Ah, yes. But despite that, he found it captivating. Saw Eleanor as a last flower of that thorny Puritan American conscience.
He mentions Franklin's courtship, Eleanor destroying his letters after his adultery, her own ambition.
And the political asset she was as Teddy Roosevelt's niece. But suggests their marriage wasn't happy personally. Her dislike of sex, Franklin's mother's influence.
He includes anecdotes like her getting a voice coach, her assessment of JFK's speaking.
Her belief in educating the public through political speech. Shares her story about a difficult house guest, her wondering about Joe Kennedy.
Vidal reflects on that hopeful period in 1933-45 and the squalid decline he saw afterward.
Lamenting the lost American belief in fixing things through human action, a faith Eleanor kept. He ends with her thoughts on Franklin's funeral train, recalling the poem about Lincoln's death.
In a more personal vein, he talks about Christopher Isherwood.
Noting his physical presence, his power of dominating despite his height, shares his own fancy about a war between the tall and short.
And the sense of alarm Isherwood seemed to give off.
Describes Chalmers' mannerisms and his own dramatic self-perception on Isherwood's staircase feeling like an icy, impenetrable demon.
Then we get to that core assertion, sex is politics.
Right. He recalls that TV interview about porn with conservative and reactionary interviewers. He explains his point with examples.
Like militaristic societies encouraging homosexuality or societies needing labor encouraging early marriage, how sexual attitudes are shaped by political needs.
He argues homosexuality can threaten patriarchy by creating men less easily controlled. Discusses using hot buttons like marijuana as distractions.
Points out the persistent unpopularity of Jews with some American Christers and the coded language used against Jews and homosexuals. Mass media, save our children.
References 1977 polling, showing conflicting views, support for civil rights, but disapproval of homosexual acts. Mentions Kopkind in Bensonville, the Save the Family cry of the New Right, covering many conservative positions.
Vidal emphasizes the manipulation needed to get people to vote against their own interests.
Traces women's subordination in religion, influenced by Christianity and communism. Notes the current Christian religiosity reinforcing wifely submission, citing Anita Bryant dumping her garbage on her husband.
He analyzes Jesus' belief in the imminent end times.
And how it influenced Paul's focus on purity and abstinence. Discusses Paul condemning lesbianism, unlike Jesus or Queen Victoria. Interprets religious condemnation of sex as partly due to Paul expecting Judgment Day.
Gives historical context for Leviticus's abominations.
Linking them to rituals of the rival cult of the great goddess in Babylon.
He observes some Jews surprisingly joining attacks on women's lib and gays, despite historical tolerance as minority.
And repeats his core idea. No homosexual person or heterosexual person, just sexual acts. Attributes the current terminal hysteria about sex to owners viewing the family as a last means of control.
Mentions conservative intellectuals like Hilton Kramer worrying about attacks on the family. Quotes Howard Phillips admitting they target hot buttons like ERA and gay rights.
Discusses Richard Vigueries' fundraising for the far right's massive assault on Congress. Mentions Phyllis Schlafly, Orrin Hatch.
Analyzes Decter's criticism of Albion Williams for portraying gay love as the deeper truth. Points out her inaccurate assumptions about gays mocking straights at Fire Island.
Counters that many same-sexers are indifferent to the heterosexual world. Critiques Decter's claim about gays in soft professions, noting they work everywhere.
Mentions Philip Roth's surprise at the number of Gentiles in America. Critiques Freud's Oedipus complex, citing New Vienna evidence suggesting child molestation was more significant than Freud admitted.
Examines Decter's unusual thesis that gays hate themselves and want extinction. Her interpretation of high partner numbers in San Francisco as obliteration of experience.
Vidal counters that many people would have numerous partners if society allowed, hinting at JFK. Connects the pink triangle for gays to the yellow star for Jews. Notes Decter's seeming inability to conceive of same-sex desire. Briefly reviews tricks, as a matter of fact.
Moving on to Tennessee Williams again. Vidal discusses the popularity of biographies of self-destructive American poets like Hart Crane.
And the trend of novelists and playwrights drinking themselves to death becoming cautionary tales, how the writer as performing self can overshadow the work.
Recounts Williams turning himself into a circus later in life, seeking attention on TV. Shares his last encounter on a talk show, Williams saying he shut his eyes when bored.
Addresses a confusion around Williams's homosexuality, suggesting the writers were often more confused than Williams.
Gives context. Williams' Bible Belt background, condemning pleasure as sin. His relatively late start exploring sex, initially heterosexually, shares the anecdote about taking Williams to meet JFK.
With Williams not even knowing who Kennedy was politically.
Recounts editing Williams' story Rubio y Morena in Paris, irritating Williams by removing his style. Explains Williams' compulsive need to write plays to possess and rearrange his life.
Discusses the recurring bird image symbol of flight, poetry, lifetime, death.
Highlights Williams rejecting the squares and their virulent rage. Quotes Williams admitting he needed physical desire for a character to write a story. Points out how Stanley Kowalski in Streetcar broke taboos by portraying male attractiveness and acknowledging female lust.
Discusses the shift to male as sex object after Brando. Notes the irony. Williams' sympathies were with Blanche, Stanley's victim. Dismisses inaccuracies in Cryer's book. Shares the witty anecdote about Williams and Thornton Wilder on alphabetical order. Ends with a fond memory of Williams' content in Key West.
Then, Oscar Wilde. Ellman's biography challenging theories about Wilde's homosexuality, arguing he wasn't less masculine than others.
Wilde inheriting a show-off and a poet persona and bad poetry talent from his mother. His self-creation as a celebrity, his wit, theatrical timing.
His invented voice, flamboyant costumes, his decorative arts lecture foreshadowing how-to books, his sensational performance in Vicksburg, recalled by Vidal's grandfather.
Now, Somerset Maugham. Calder's biography focusing on the conflict. Maugham the faggot versus Maugham the potential husband.
Vidal critiques the witch doctor approach, Freudian analysis in academia. Underscores the consequences for same-sexers like Wilde. Suspects Maugham's experiences with women were essentially hydraulic.
Contrasts Maugham with Noel Coward's reported celibacy with women. Notes Maugham's hands-off approach to theater rehearsals.
Publication of human bondage while spying for England established him as serious. Mentions Dr. Nehans' rejuvenation treatments attracting the famous, including Pius XII. Maugham surviving in rude bodily health for years after.
Recounts the senile Maugham destroying his persona with malicious memoirs, trying to disinherit his daughter. A contrast to his earlier control. Analyzes Maugham's assumption about Matthew Arnold's style requiring labor, revealing Maugham's own discipline.
Notes Maugham calling himself truthful but often concealing knowledge for career reasons. Discusses the fictional journey to Bandonera in a novel Vidal liked. Outlines the tragic plot. Fred, Louise, Eric Christensen, suicide, accidental murder. Dr. Saunders understanding Fred's demise.
Okay, some broader reflections from Vidal on sex, religion, society. He references Freud. Societal rules about sex create discontent.
Then Vidal's sweeping claim, practically the book, Judaism, Christianity, Islam says about sex, is wrong. Contrasts biology with monogamy being drilled in for practical child-rearing reasons.
Expresses skepticism about low reported rates of same-sex activity in a survey. Recalls the normalcy of male messing around in pre-war southern towns.
Reflects on creating a sky god in our image in a hostile early world. Notes conservatives failed to capture the House until '94, resorting to hot buttons, sex, drugs. instead of real politics.
Finally, the interviews with Vidal himself, Solomon describing Vidal's villa in Ravello, context of palimpsest publication.
Vidal consistently challenging assumptions. No gay persons defending prostitution. Commenting on the absence of sex in his long partnership with Howard Austin, explaining he doesn't aim to be reassuring about sex.
Disagrees that sex hinders writing, citing Hemingway, refuses categorization, advocates radical approaches, attacking monotheism, believes change comes from collapse, prefers social democracy, mentions People's Party with Dr. Spock.
Assesses writer John Horn Burns. Reflects on finding his own tone of voice. Discusses TV writing, unmade screenplays, Plaza, Dreams. Simple plan to leave money to Howard Austin. Idea for a love story film about J. Edgar Hoover.
Skeptical about gay liberation's lasting impact on most Americans, observes declining quality of trade, emergence of a more feminine male type, speculates on physical or environmental factors.
Comments on TV's passivizing effects. Agrees with some of Shockley's controversial theories on declining achievement. Nostalgic for when sex felt like a great adventure.
Compares Ford's Watergate reaction to seeing the monster in a horror film. Analyzes Nixon's self-destructive character, feeling not worthy. Predicts potential military dictatorship disguised as Americanism. Skeptical about full social acceptance. Bernstein's inclusion of blacks as 1960s chic.
Scherer's evolving view of Rockefeller, inspired to real insecurity. Critical of ethnic influence in America. Observes linguistic changes, near English. Dismisses Time magazine as empty of content.
Reacts to negative reviews of Myron, use of evil, claims of lack of courage. Anecdotes about David Susskind trying to get Rehnquist Bork to debate Vidal about Myron. Ideas for a tricky film adaptation, Woody Allen, Trisha Nixon.
Believes Hollywood altered our self-concept. Thinks TV series, All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, had more impact on Moores than film. Fascinated by George Arliss's acting. Observes his generation was influenced by film in a way no longer true.
Repeats his law of physics. No action without reaction. Asserts arts are being destroyed from within. Satirical ideas for improving the novel. Humorous response to labels, secretly Lon McAllister.
Recounts being dead broke, turning to TV, movies, theater, politics for money. Frustrated his sex politics, essays aren't better known. Doubts anyone is 100% heterosexual and homosexual at 50-50. Analogy of states categorizing citizens for control.
Reluctant to speak extensively on attitudes, not a virologist. Personal connection via nephew Hugh Steers. Prioritizes attacking underlying issues, national security state, Supreme Court religious mentality, over focusing solely on AIDS.
Experiences with divisiveness on the American left. Admires Jonathan Ned Katz's history work. Primary interest now, destroying monotheism in the U.S. Humorous dismissal of writing young love stories, despite Lincoln's suggestion. Identifies Buchanan Pierce as potentially gay. Final remark. I leave that to you. Anyway.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Gore Vidal's Sexually Speaking, we've definitely traversed his characteristically incisive and often challenging perspectives on a huge range of topics.
All from this collection you provided. It really is a rich tapestry of his thoughts on how society constructs and regulates sexuality, the tensions between desire and norms, law, religion, politics.
Yeah. And Vidal's consistent call, really, to challenge assumptions and resist rigid categories.
Yeah.
It does offer a powerful lens for viewing these ongoing parts of the human experience. Definitely gives you a lot to think about.
Absolutely. And considering Vidal's potent assertion that sex is politics and his observations on how fear and control often underpin attitudes toward sexuality, well, what hot buttons do you think are being deliberately pushed today? And maybe more crucially, what might be the unspoken political motivations behind them? Is our understanding and acceptance of diverse sexualities genuinely progressing? Or are we just seeing maybe a new version of some very old power dynamics at play?